He made her lunch every morning. That detail matters. Remember it. Because on the morning everything changed, on the morning a worksheet hit a classroom floor, and 32 children forgot how to breathe. Brigadier General Garrett Hale was standing in his kitchen in Hartford, Connecticut, pressing the heel of his hand against a cutting board, slicing an apple into careful pieces. Not wedges, slices. Because Maya didn't like the tough part at the end of a wedge, the fibrous bit near the core that caught in her teeth. She'd mentioned it once 6 weeks ago, casually, the way children mention things when they don't expect anyone to actually remember. And Garrett had remembered. He'd been slicing apples that way ever since, and had never once pointed out that he did. Turkey on wheat bread, apple slices in a small zip bag, a packet of crackers on the side because she'd gone through a phase of liking crackers with lunch, and he wasn't certain the phase had ended. And in the bottom left corner of the bag, folded twice into a small square, a note written in his careful, deliberate handwriting. "You are braver than you know. Love, Dad." He wrote a note every single morning. Had done so since her first week in this house 3 years ago, when she was 5 years old and so small and so watchful that it had physically hurt him to look at her sometimes. Not every note said the same thing. Some were silly. Some were just a drawing of a lopsided star because he'd run out of time and didn't want to leave the bag empty. But every morning, without exception, there was something folded into the corner. She had never once mentioned the notes. He had never once stopped writing them. The kitchen was quiet at this hour. 6:47 in the morning, October light coming through the window above the sink, thin and pale, the particular light of New England autumn, when the warmth is leaving but hasn't quite gone. On the mantel in the living room, just visible through the doorway, a flag folded into a triangle sat in its case. Beside it, a framed commendation from the Department of Defense. On the wall to the left, a Distinguished Service Medal mounted behind glass, and next to it a photograph Garrett Hale, 20 years younger, standing in a desert that looked like the surface of another planet, surrounded by men whose faces carried the expression of people who had agreed to do something very hard and were still in the middle of doing it. He had led 240 soldiers through 14 months in Afghanistan. He had made decisions in rooms where the wrong answer meant men came home in boxes. He had sat across from generals and senators and spoken without flinching about things that would make most people's hands shake. He was 58 years old. He had spent 30 years learning how to be unafraid. And the most terrifying thing he had ever done in his life was sign a piece of paper 3 years ago that said Maya was his daughter. Not because he hadn't wanted to. He had wanted to with a certainty he hadn't felt about anything in a long time. But because she had looked at him that first day with eyes that were doing rapid, exhausted calculations, this man, this house, this room with the moon-shaped nightlight he'd put on her dresser, all of it being measured against every previous time she'd been handed a beginning that turned into an ending. She'd looked at him the way a person looks at something they want very badly but have been burned by before. And he'd understood with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of reading rooms that she was waiting for him to change his mind. He hadn't. He never would. But understanding that she was waiting and knowing how to make her stop waiting, those were two entirely different problems. And Garrett Hale, who had solutions for most problems, had found himself genuinely uncertain how to solve this one. He zipped the lunch bag and set it on the counter beside her backpack. The backpack was slightly too big for her frame. She'd picked it out herself at the store, insisted on the dark blue one with the small star patch on the front pocket, and it sat on her shoulders in a way that looked slightly precarious, like it might tip her backward. He had not suggested a smaller one. She had chosen it, and that meant something. He heard her feet on the stairs, small, careful steps. Maya moved through the world quietly, which was something he had noticed early and understood even earlier. Children who had been moved around learned to take up less space. They kept their footsteps soft and their voices low and their needs modest because need was a variable that complicated things, and complicated things led to conversations, and conversations sometimes led to the word unfortunately. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school clothes. Box braids, neat green sweater, the dark pants she preferred because they had pockets deep enough to actually hold things, which she had strong opinions about. She looked at the counter, saw the lunch bag, and picked it up without comment and tucked it into her backpack. "Morning," Garrett said. "Morning. Sleep okay?" Yes. This was the shape of their mornings. Brief, functional, comfortable, in a way that had been built slowly over 3 years, not forced, not performed, just the natural shorthand of two people who had figured out how to exist in the same space without making it complicated. He didn't pepper her with questions. She didn't perform cheerfulness. She didn't feel. They had an agreement, unspoken and absolute, that mornings were for being quiet together, not for filling silence with noise. He drove her to school at 7:15. She held his hand at the entrance the way she did every morning, a little longer than strictly necessary, her fingers wrapped around two of his, with the grip of someone who wanted the contact but didn't want to make a thing of it. He crouched down to her level, he always did. This had done it since day one because he'd read somewhere once that adults who crouch down are telling children their faces are worth looking at directly, and smoothed a braid that had come slightly loose near her left ear. "Good day," he said. "Not have a good day, just good day," like a small instruction to the universe. She almost smiled. Went inside. He watched the door close behind her and stood there for a moment in the October chill, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the entrance to Maplewood Elementary School, the way he'd once looked at terrain he was about to move through. He didn't know yet that he was already in enemy territory. He wouldn't understand that for another 3 weeks. Inside room 14, at the front of a classroom that smelled like dry erase markers and the institutional warmth of elementary school heating systems, Mrs. Sylvia Dunn was already at her desk when the first students began arriving. She was 54 years old. She had been teaching for 27 years. On the wall near the door, framed in simple black, hung a certificate, Maplewood Elementary School Teacher of the Year 2019. It had been a genuine honor when she'd received it. She wasn't sure she would recognize the woman who earned it anymore. Teaching had done something to Sylvia Dunn over 27 years, and it hadn't done it suddenly. It had done it the way water shapes stone, gradually, continuously, without a single dramatic moment you could point to and say, there, that was when it changed. Budget cuts arrived, and then more budget cuts. Class sizes grew. 32 students in a room designed for 24. Administrators cycled through with clipboards and initiatives and frameworks measuring teacher effectiveness in metrics that had nothing to do with whether a child went home feeling seen. She had spent years fighting those metrics, staying late, buying supplies from her own salary, making phone calls in the evening to parents who didn't know she was doing it. And then somewhere in the accumulated weight of it, she had stopped fighting and started surviving. The armor came on gradually. First, it was a kind of practiced distance, not cruel, just efficient, because efficiency was how you got through 32 students a day without losing your mind. Then the distance became a lens, and the lens became a habit of deciding what she was going to get from a child before the child had had a chance to show her. She called it experience. She called it knowing which students were going to need more than she had left to give. She had given herself very convincing reasons to stop being surprised by anyone. Maya had arrived at Maplewood in September, 3 months into the school year. A transfer form and a name on the class list. A quiet little girl with neat box braids and a backpack slightly too large for her. Sylvia had looked at her on the first day and made a series of rapid calculations that she would never have admitted to making. Quiet child, transfer mid-year, probably behind, probably a difficult home situation, probably going to require scaffolding she no longer had the energy to build. She had decided in the span of about 40 seconds not to invest. It was the most consequential 40 seconds of Sylvia Dunn's professional life, and she had spent them barely looking up from her attendance sheet. What happened next didn't happen all at once. That's important to understand. The thing about a pattern is that each individual piece of it can be explained away. A sigh, a redirection, a comment that extracted from context and held up to the light looks like nothing. It's only when you lay them end to end that you see the shape of what they make. The first piece arrived in the second week of October. Maya had come in that morning with something bright in her face, the brightness of a child who has done something she's proud of and is working up the courage to share it. She'd been to the park with her father that weekend. She'd collected leaves in red and orange and gold, studied them the way children study things that matter to them, and then gone home and painted them. The painting was on a piece of paper she'd folded and tucked into the front pocket of the too big backpack, the one with the star patch. During morning circle, she raised her hand. Sylvia glanced at her, then at the clock, then at the lesson plan on her desk. "That's not part of today's lesson, Maya. Put it away." It wasn't a terrible thing to say. Teachers redirected students dozens of times a day. Taken alone in isolation, it was a minor moment, a small course correction. But it was the way she said it, the way she didn't really look the way Maya's offering was dispensed with before it had been fully received that made something happen in Maya's face. Something that had been trying to open quietly closed again. She put the painting back in the front pocket of the backpack. She folded her hands on her desk. She looked at the board. She never brought anything from home to share again. The second piece came 2 weeks later during reading circle. The class was working through a passage that contained the word pastoral. It was an adult word dropped into a children's book by someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be 7, to encounter a word that had no foothold in any experience you'd had yet. Maya read it the way she'd heard it in her head pastoral. Sylvia sighed. It was barely audible, a small, controlled exhale. But in the silence of reading circle, it carried the way a whisper carries in an empty room. She looked up from her copy of the text, looked at the class, and said the word clearly. Pastoral. Can someone help her with this? We've covered this. They hadn't. Not once. The word had not appeared in any previous lesson. But Maya didn't say this. She nodded, folded her hands, made herself smaller. Children who are in survival mode learn to do that, to physically compress themselves, to draw the edges of their presence inward, to take up less room in a space that has indicated it doesn't have room for them. Adults lose that capacity somewhere in the years of assuming they belong wherever they stand. Maya had never been allowed to assume that. The third piece, and the worst of the three, happened on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Verbal math quiz. Garrett had been working through multiplication tables with her at the kitchen table, but they hadn't gotten to subtraction review yet, and Maya was tired. The kind of tired that settles into a 7-year-old by 3 in the afternoon. Not physical exhaustion, but the specific depletion of a child who has been holding herself very carefully together since 7:15 in the morning. 7 minus 4. She said 2. She knew it was wrong the moment it left her mouth. She could feel it. Her face did something quick and complicated, the expression of a child recalculating, trying to find the correct answer in the half-second before the wrong one fully landed. Sylvia didn't correct her, didn't move on, didn't say anything at all. She simply stood beside Maya's desk and waited. Full 30 seconds of silence. 32 children recited private prayers of invisibility. The clock on the wall above the whiteboard seemed to slow. Maya sat with her answer hanging in the air. The wrong answer, and the silence around it was worse than any correction would have been. Then, maybe we need to call your mother. The room went completely still. Maya's face moved through several things in very quick succession and arrived somewhere that was not quite hurt and not quite anger and not quite anything with a clean name. It was the expression of a child who has an entire answer to give a complete, complicated, true answer, and has learned through long experience that giving the true answer is a gamble, and the safest bet is to say nothing at all. So she said nothing. 31 other children breathed again slowly, grateful not to be her. On the second row from the window, a girl named Wren sat with her fists pressed flat under her desk. She was 8 years old. She had a gap between her front teeth and a habit of watching things closely, and a grandmother who had told her once that the most important thing a person could do in a room was to actually look at what was happening. Wren looked. She watched Maya's face move through those expressions and arrive at nothing. She watched Sylvia turn back to the board. She watched Maya pick up her pencil and stare at the paper in front of her. Wren would remember this day for the rest of her life, not because of what happened today, because of what was coming. That evening, Garrett made dinner. He was making pasta, which Maya liked, with the sauce from the jar she preferred. He'd tried making it from scratch, once spent 45 minutes on it, and she'd politely asked if there was any of the jar kind left. He'd found this endearing in a way he couldn't fully explain. He kept 3 jars in the pantry at all times now. She sat at the kitchen table while he cooked, backpack on the chair beside her, homework out, but not started. She was turning her fork over in her hands end over end, a slow, repetitive motion that he'd learned to recognize. It meant she was working something out internally. He let her work. He didn't ask how her day was. He'd learned early that, "How was your day?" produced one-word answers from Maya, the way a slot machine produced nickels occasionally with no predictable pattern, never enough to make you feel like you'd won anything. What worked was being present and quiet and patient until she was ready, which required the same skill set as certain kinds of negotiation. You had to want the outcome without appearing to want it. He put the pasta on, got plates down from the cabinet. After a while, without looking up from the fork in her hands, Maya said, "Dad, yeah, if your mom isn't there." She paused, reorganized. "If you don't have a mom, does that mean you don't count as much?" Garrett set a plate on the counter, turned off the heat on the stove, turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at his daughter. He took a moment before answering, not because he didn't know what he thought, but because some answers deserve to be given with the full weight of the person behind them. "No," he said. "It means the person who asked the question wasn't paying attention." Maya looked at him, processed, nodded slowly with the nod of a child who is logging something in a place where she keeps important information. She picked up her pencil and started her homework. Garrett served the pasta. They ate. She told him about a book they were reading in class, a story about a dog that she thought was unrealistic because the dog understood too much. He agreed that the dog probably understood too much. She said she thought the author should have been more honest about what dogs actually know, which he also agreed with, and which made her look briefly pleased in the quiet way she did when an opinion of hers was taken seriously. He washed the dishes. She went upstairs. He heard her moving around in her room, the soft, familiar sounds of his daughter ending her day. The scrape of the desk chair, the small click of the closet door, and then eventually through the ceiling, silence. He sat back down at the kitchen table. The kitchen was quiet again. October had fully arrived by now, and the evenings in Hartford came in fast and dark, and the house settled around him the way old houses settle, in the cold small creaks and adjustments as the temperature dropped. He could see through the kitchen doorway the edge of the moon-shaped nightlight he'd ordered the week Maya came home, the one he'd put in her room without comment, the one she still used every night without comment. That nightlight had never been discussed between them. It was just there. It would keep being there. He thought about the question she'd asked. He thought about the word mother in the mouth of a child who had been moved through 4 homes in 3 years by a system that ran on paperwork and good intentions and chronic underfunding. He thought about the specific weight of that question. If your mom isn't there, does that mean you don't count as much? And he thought about who had made a 7-year-old girl perform that calculation in the first place and why. He didn't have an answer yet, but he was beginning to feel the outline of a problem, the shape of something he couldn't fully see but could already feel pressing against the edges of the days. The man who would help him see the full shape of it was pushing a cart with a squeaky left wheel down the main corridor of Maplewood Elementary at that precise moment. Earl Briggs was 62 years old. He had worked as head custodian at Maplewood for 15 years, which made him by any meaningful measure more of a permanent institution than most of the people who worked there. Principals had come and gone. Teachers had burned bright and burned out. 3 different superintendents had passed through the district. Earl had watched all of it from the corridors, from the rooms he maintained, from the vantage point of a man who was considered by most of the adults in the building to be essentially invisible. He had a granddaughter named Bay. She was 8 years old. She had a laugh that made Earl's chest feel too full to hold everything it was holding, and she made that expression sometimes when something hurt, and she was trying very hard to make sure no one could see that it hurt, that broke something in him quietly every time he saw it. He'd seen that expression today. Not on B, on the small girl with the too big backpack in room 14. He'd been mopping the hall outside room 14 when the door cracked open for a student passing through. He'd heard the silence inside before he heard anything else, the pressed flat silence of a classroom where something is happening that no one feels safe enough to name. Through the gap in the door, he'd watch the worksheet fall. He'd watch Maya bend down and pick it up with trembling hands. And he'd watched her face as she straightened the movement of it, through hurt, through the attempt to contain hurt, through the settling into a practiced neutral that was somehow worse than either. Earl set his mop against the wall. He stood there for a moment in the empty corridor, hand resting on the handle of the cart, the squeaky wheel still and silent. Then he reached into the front pocket of his uniform shirt and took out a small notebook. It was a plain thing, dark blue cover, narrow ruled pages, the kind you could buy in a drugstore for $1.99. He'd carried one for years for maintenance notes, things to order, things to fix. He opened it to the first clean page. He wrote the date, the time, what he had observed. He was not yet certain what he was building. He only knew that patterns required documentation, that documentation required consistency, and that consistency required starting today and not waiting for a better day that might not come. He put the notebook back in his pocket, picked up his mop, kept moving down the corridor. 3 days after that evening in the kitchen, Garrett went to see Principal Douglas Merritt. He went in the morning before school dressed in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray button-down, no indication of rank. He'd learned in a long career that the uniform changed how rooms received. You rearranged the furniture of people's attention, and he wanted to be received plainly for this. He wanted the conversation to be about his daughter, not about his biography. Merritt was 52, a compact man with a careful professional manner and the energy of an administrator who had learned to manage situations before they became problems. His office had framed photographs of school events on every wall class, pictures field day, the kind of institutional visual wallpaper that communicated investment in community without saying anything specific about it. Garrett sat across from him and explained what he'd observed. The change in Maya over the previous weeks. The questions she'd asked at the kitchen table. His concern that something in the classroom environment was contributing to a pattern he couldn't fully see, but could clearly feel. He was measured, specific. He did not raise his voice. Merritt listened, made appropriate listening sounds, tilted his head with practiced concern. And then he said, "Mrs. Dunn is one of our most experienced teachers. She received our Teacher of the Year recognition in 2019. These kinds of adjustments for transfer students especially, they take time. Children need to find their footing. I'd encourage you to give Maya a bit more room to settle in." Garrett looked at him. Merritt held his gaze with the relaxed confidence of a man who had given this speech, or a version of it, many times before and had never once had it fail to conclude the meeting. "I appreciate your time," Garrett said. He stood, shook Merritt's hand, left. He walked to his car in the parking lot, started the engine, and sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Outside, the October morning was sharp and clear, leaves moving on the trees at the edge of the school grounds. The school building solid and ordinary and absolutely opaque. He was 68 days into fatherhood as a permanent condition. The adoption had been finalized 3 years ago. But Maya had only been fully, legally, irrevocably his for 68 days, a number he knew because he had counted them, and he had just walked out of a conversation with the man responsible for his daughter's safety at school. And he had nothing. No next move, no leverage, no terrain he knew how to cross. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Garrett Hale was operating without a map. It unsettled him in a way that combat had never quite managed. Because in combat, the parameters were clear. In combat, you knew who you were fighting and what winning looked like, and what the acceptable cost of winning might be. This was different. This was a 7-year-old who turned her fork over in her hands and asked quiet questions that contained years of accumulated weight, and a school building that functioned on institutional inertia, and the unspoken agreement that established teachers were more credible than concerned fathers, and a problem that left no marks and produced no evidence, and happened in a room 32 children walked into every morning and never talked about. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and then he went to the pickup line the next morning and introduced himself plainly to 3 people he'd been standing near for weeks without ever speaking to. The first was a woman named Sandra. Her daughter's 2nd grade had started complaining of stomach aches every Sunday evening, severe enough that they'd taken her to the pediatrician twice. The pediatrician had found nothing physical. The stomach aches resolved every Sunday night around 9 o'clock and didn't reappear until the following Sunday. Sandra had a theory. She hadn't wanted to say it out loud until someone else said it first. The second was a man named Phil. His son had come home 3 weeks ago and, unprompted at the dinner table, announced with quiet conviction, "I think I'm stupid, Dad." Phil had spent an hour that evening explaining why that wasn't true. His son had listened politely and then gone to bed, and Phil had sat at the dinner table afterward with the helplessness of a parent who had said all the right things and felt none of them had landed. The third was an older woman, late 60s, silver hair, a posture that conveyed someone who had been patient for a very long time and was finding the patience increasingly difficult to maintain. Her granddaughter, room 14. She had called Merritt's office 6 weeks ago. She had been told these things took time. Garrett listened to all 3 of them in the October morning cold, standing in the school parking lot with the sound of buses arriving and children moving across the asphalt and the ordinary noise of a school day beginning. He filed what he heard in the part of his mind where he filed intelligence. Corroborating accounts, independent sources. The same pattern described separately from different angles. That evening, Maya was quiet again at dinner. Not the fork-turning quiet of 3 days ago. A different kind. A compacted quiet, the quiet of a child conserving energy. She ate. She answered his questions in the short functional way that meant she was managing something internally and didn't have room for conversation on top of it. He didn't push. He washed the dishes. He listened to her go upstairs. He sat back down at the kitchen table and he opened the drawer in front of him. The narrow utility drawer that held pens and batteries and other small miscellaneous things, and he found what he was looking for almost immediately. A folded piece of paper, creased soft from age. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was large and imprecise, the handwriting of a 5-year-old who had just learned to hold a pencil with any real control. The letters wandered slightly on the page, sized inconsistently, some of them leaning like they weren't sure which direction was up yet. "I'm nervous," it said, "but I think this could be home." She had left it on his kitchen table her third night in this house. He didn't know why she'd written it. He didn't know if she'd meant for him to find it. He'd never asked. He'd folded it and put it in the drawer and left it there ever since. And he took it out sometimes when he needed to remember the specific gravity of what he'd said yes to. He held it now in the October quiet of his kitchen and looked at the looping, uncertain letters of a 5-year-old girl who had moved through 4 homes in 3 years and had found it in herself on the third night in a strange house with a man she barely knew to write the word home in a sentence that reached towards something. He sat with that for a long time. Then he put the paper carefully back in the drawer. He picked up his phone. He thought for a moment about who to call. Not Merritt. Not yet. Someone who understood the architecture of school systems, the specific leverage points, the places where pressure could be applied, and where it would just diffuse harmlessly into the institution's capacity for self-protection. He had a contact at the Connecticut State Department of Education. A woman named Arlene, 15 years a colleague in a different sense of the word. They'd worked adjacent to each other on federal-level programs in the early 2000s, when Garrett was doing work that overlapped occasionally with education policy. She was direct and honest and did not believe in softening things. He called her. She picked up on the third ring. He told her what he had, what he'd observed, what 3 other parents had told him in the parking lot, what the school had said when a grandmother called 6 weeks ago. Arlene was quiet for a moment. Then she told him what a parent's options were, what documentation looked like at the district level, what the formal inquiry process required and who had the authority to initiate it, and what happened when a parent filed a concern directly with the district's family advocacy office, rather than routing it through the school's own administration. He asked questions. She answered. He took notes in the small, dense shorthand he'd developed over 30 years of needing to hold information accurately under pressure. When he hung up, it was past 11. The house was fully dark now. He could hear faintly the sound of Maya's sound machine in her room upstairs. She slept with it on Ocean Sounds, which she'd chosen herself from a list he'd offered her, and which had struck him at the time as a very specific choice for a child who had never lived near the ocean. As though she'd decided she wanted to fall asleep to something vast and continuous, something that didn't stop. He put the notebook away. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood for a moment in the dark at the bottom of the stairs. Tomorrow morning he would make her lunch. Turkey on wheat. Apple slices. A note folded into the corner of the bag. He would drive her to school. He would crouch down at the entrance and smooth whatever needed smoothing and say good day to the universe on her behalf. And then he would begin to build something that could not be waved away. He didn't know yet about the notebook in Earl Briggs' shirt pocket. He didn't know that 15 days of careful, dated, specific documentation were already accumulating in the front pocket of a custodian's uniform, written in the plain language of a man who had spent 15 years watching from corridors and had decided that what he was seeing in room 14 required a record that could not be argued with. He didn't know about Nora Aldrich yet, the school counselor, 35 years old, with a lanyard that had too many keys and a coffee mug that said, "Breathe," in sans serif font, a mug she rarely had time to finish because there were always more children waiting than there were hours to see them. He didn't know that the pieces were already assembling around his daughter, like a quiet, invisible architecture of protection. He only knew that somewhere above him, in a room with a moon-shaped nightlight, his 7-year-old daughter was sleeping. And that whatever it required of him, every resource, every contact, every conversation, every piece of patience he possessed, he was going to make sure the world she walked into every morning became worthy of her. He went upstairs. He paused outside her door. from inside the soft sound of ocean waves. He stood there for a moment in the dark hallway of his house in Hartford, Connecticut, a man who had navigated a great deal of difficult terrain in his life, standing outside a closed door and feeling with complete clarity the weight of the thing that mattered most. Then he went to bed. In the morning, he made her lunch. He always did. The notebook had 14 pages filled by the time Earl Briggs brought it to Nora Aldrich. 14 pages of dates and times and specific unembellished observations written in the careful block letters of a man who had spent 15 years understanding that the most useful thing a person could be in any institution was accurate. October 9th, room 14. 22 a.m. student. Maya asked to share work during morning circle. Teacher declined without review. Student's expression changed. Did not raise hand again for remainder of morning session. October 14th, hallway outside room 14. 2:15 p.m. Overheard teacher corrects student's pronunciation in front of class. Tone performative. Class went silent. Student did not respond. October 21st. Room 14 visible through door during passing period. 1:48 p.m. Teacher stood beside student's desk without speaking for approximately 30 seconds following incorrect verbal answer. Then said, "Maybe we need to call your mother." Student did not respond. Classroom atmosphere suppressed. 14 pages, 19 incidents across 11 weeks. Every one of them minor in isolation. Every one of them laid end to end, forming a shape that was not minor at all. Earl had not gone looking for this. That was the thing he would say later when people asked him about it. He hadn't been watching. Room 14 specifically hadn't had a theory he was trying to prove. He'd just been doing what he'd done every working day for 15 years, moving through the building with his cart and his squeaky wheel, maintaining things, replacing things, being present in the corridors, in the way that people who are considered invisible are always present fully quietly without anyone adjusting their behavior to account for him. He knew everything that happened in this building. He knew which teachers raised their voices and which ones lowered them when they were trying to make a point. He knew which classrooms had energy and which ones had compliance. He knew the difference between a silent classroom where children were concentrating and a silent classroom where children were afraid. Room 14 had been the second kind for weeks. He'd been carrying the notebook for 11 days before he ran into Nora Aldrich in the main corridor on a Tuesday afternoon. She was moving fast the way she always moved, lanyard swinging, a stack of folders pressed against her chest, the half-full coffee mug in her free hand. She had the expression of someone managing 7 things simultaneously and doing it with enough competence that from the outside, it looked like she was only managing 4. "Dr. Aldrich," Earl said. She stopped, turned, looked at him with direct, full attention, not the reflexive acknowledgement that most people offered when someone they considered peripheral said their name, but actual attention, the kind that required you to stop doing the other things. She had always done this. It was one of the things Earl respected about her without having ever mentioned it. "Earl, what do you need? Minute of your time," he said. "When you have it." She looked at her watch, looked at the folders, looked back at him, and something in his face communicated that this was not a maintenance issue, not a scheduling question, not any of the routine things he might ordinarily bring to her. "Now," she said. He told her. Calmly, in order the way he'd written it, dates first, then time, then what he'd seen or heard, no editorializing, no conclusions offered beyond the facts themselves. He watched her face as he spoke. She kept it professional and composed, which was her training. But her eyes were doing something different from her face, and Earl was good enough at reading rooms to see the difference. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been building?" "Since she arrived," Earl said. "But I didn't want to bring something half-formed. You know how that goes." She knew exactly how that went. An accusation without documentation went into a file and sat there, and the teacher found out there was a complaint, and the child in question found themselves in a classroom where the teacher now had a reason to be careful. Not a reason to be better, a reason to be careful, and nothing improved and everything got more complicated. "Can I see it?" Nora said. He took the notebook from his shirt pocket and held it out. She set her folders on the cart and opened it, read slowly, turned pages. Earl watched her jaw tighten once briefly around page 6 and then settle back into professional neutral. She closed the notebook. "We build it properly," she said. "Together." Earl nodded once. She handed the notebook back. He put it in his pocket. She picked up her folders, rebalanced them against her chest, reclaimed her coffee mug. They stood in the corridor for a moment, two people who had just agreed to do something that would be slow and careful and necessary. "I'll schedule routine check-ins," Nora said. "Standard counselor wellness rounds. No flags raised." "Good," Earl said. She moved off down the corridor. He picked up the handle of his cart. The wheel squeaked as he pushed it forward. Nora Aldrich requested routine counselor check-ins with 6 students across 3 classrooms. Standard procedure, end-of-semester wellness touch base. The kind of administrative motion that produced no friction because it required none. It was simply part of what she did, and everyone in the building expected her to do it, and no one looked twice. She scheduled Maya for a Thursday afternoon in the second week of November. The counselor's office was small and warm, with a beanbag chair in the corner that children inevitably migrated toward a window that looked onto the parking lot and a bookshelf arranged in a way that communicated safety rather than authority. No desk between counselor and child, just 2 chairs at an angle close enough for conversation, far enough for comfort. Nora had arranged this office carefully in her first week at Maplewood 6 years ago and had not changed it since. Maya came in with the careful posture of a child entering an unfamiliar space and not yet certain of the rules. She looked at the beanbag chair, then at Nora, then back at the beanbag chair. "Go ahead," Nora said. Maya settled into it, which took a moment. Beanbag chairs required a kind of surrender that children who were accustomed to staying ready sometimes found difficult. But she settled. Nora asked her about her favorite part of school. Maya said recess. Nora asked about what she liked to do at recess. Maya said she and Ren had been playing a game they invented that involved a complicated set of rules about which sections of the playground counted as different territories, and that the rules changed every day by mutual agreement, and that this was the best part of it. Nora made a note: child has at least one strong peer connection. Child is creative, generates structure collaboratively. Child is capable of joy. That last part she underlined lightly as a reminder to herself, as something to hold on to in what was coming. She asked what was hardest about school this year. Maya was quiet. It was the quiet of a child doing rapid internal mathematics about the cost of honesty. Nora recognized it. She'd seen it hundreds of times in hundreds of variations. She didn't rush it. She waited with the stillness of someone who understood that this silence was not empty. It was full. It just needed time to become words. "When I get something wrong," Maya said finally, "in front of everybody." "Does that happen a lot?" Maya nodded, one small definitive nod. "What does it feel like when that happens?" The longest pause yet. Maya looked at the window, looked at her hands. The fingers of her left hand were tracing a small pattern on the surface of the beanbag chair, in unconscious motion, repetitive, self-soothing. "Like I'm taking up space I didn't earn." Nora kept her face warm and still. She asked 2 more questions, light ones, easy ones. Let the conversation find its way back toward the invented playground game and whether the territories had names. Maya said yes, they had very specific names, and told her 2 of them, and by the time Maya left the office, she was almost smiling. The door closed. Nora looked down at her notepad. She had underlined the sentence twice, pressing hard enough that she could feel it through the paper. "Like I'm taking up space I didn't earn." Those were not words a 7-year-old assembled independently. Children at 7 did not generate the concept of unearned space. They did not produce that specific grammar, the transactional framing of existence, as something that required justification, the idea that presence was a privilege contingent on performance. They absorbed it. They inhaled it from environments that repeated it to them in 1,000 small ways over enough time that it stopped sounding like something being said to them and started sounding like something true about them. Nora had been doing this work for 6 years. She knew the difference between a child who was struggling and a child who was being diminished. She knew what the second one looked like from the inside. She added the session notes to the folder Earl had helped her begin. Across the building in room 14, Sylvia Dunn was standing at the whiteboard running the afternoon's math review. The students in front of her were compliant and attentive, in the way children are attentive when they are not interested, but have learned that the cost of visible inattention is higher than the cost of performing engagement. She moved through the material efficiently. She answered questions when they arose, which was rarely. The room ran smoothly. That evening, after the last student left and the corridor outside went quiet, Sylvia sat alone at her desk. She had been doing this at the end of some days lately, not grading, not planning, just sitting. She wasn't reviewing anything productive. She was just sitting in her classroom in the silence of an empty school building, the fluorescent lights slightly too bright overhead, the smell of dry erase marker faint in the air. She pulled up the class roster on her desk tablet, scrolled through the names, stopped at Maya's, and something happened. It was not dramatic, it was barely perceptible, but something that lived deeper than her armor, deeper than 27 years of accumulated protective distance surfaced for a moment. A memory from a very long time ago, her second year teaching a student who had arrived in her class, reading 2 years behind grade level, written off by every teacher he'd had before her. She'd stayed late with him, months of late afternoons, her own materials, her own time. She remembered the evening he'd read an entire passage without stopping, without struggling, and the sound he'd made, this involuntary sound of pure surprise at himself, like he'd just discovered something he hadn't known was in him. She remembered that she had cried on the drive home that night. The good kind. The kind that meant something had happened that mattered. She looked at Maya's name on the roster. The memory receded. She closed the tablet, stood up, put on her coat, turned off the lights, walked out. This is what made what Sylvia Dunn did different from simple burnout, different from the ordinary damage that institutions inflict on the people inside them. Burnout is passive. Burnout is exhaustion that closes a person's capacity for response. What Sylvia had done was something more deliberate. She had felt the thing that would have changed her course, felt it clearly enough to recognize it, and had chosen to set it down and walk away. She knew. And she had decided that knowing was not enough reason to change. That was the thing Garrett would understand later when he had the full picture. Not the burnout, the choice. Garrett spent the week after his conversation with Arlene building what he thought of privately as a second front. He requested a formal meeting with the district's family advocacy office. Not merit, not the school level, the district level, the office with actual investigative authority. He introduced himself as a parent, not a general. He presented what he had his own observations over 11 weeks. The 3 conversations in the parking lot, the documented brush-off of a grandmother's complaint 6 weeks prior. The advocate he met with was a careful woman named Patricia Morse, who listened with the practiced neutrality of someone trained not to signal conclusions before documentation was complete. She told him what the formal process required. He gave her what he had. She told him she would open a preliminary inquiry and that more documentation from inside the school would substantially strengthen the record. He drove home and called Arlene again to update her. He did not tell Maya any of this, because Maya was 7 years old and her job was to go to school and make the complicated playground game with Ren and tell him about unrealistic dogs at dinner. His job was to construct the architecture of accountability around her without making her the instrument of it. Children should not have to carry the weight of their own protection. That was the job of adults. He was learning in these weeks that being a father was a different kind of command than anything he'd held before. In his military life, leadership meant having more information than the people beneath you making decisions from clarity. Parenting. Maya meant making decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty. You couldn't fully see what was happening to her, couldn't fully access the room where the damage was occurring, couldn't deploy anything directly. You had to work from the edges. You had to trust that the small things you controlled, the lunch, the note, the crouching down at the school entrance, the patience at the dinner table were accumulating into something that held her while you worked the larger problem. Some mornings he was confident this was true. Some mornings he crouched at the entrance and watched the door close behind her and drove home with the anxiety of a man who understood risk and could not calculate this one. On a Wednesday in the second week of November, 2 things happened on the same day. The first, Earl completed his notebook. 14 pages, 19 incidents spanning 6 weeks of observation. He made a clean copy, transferred everything to a second notebook, same format, same careful block letters, but organized now into a clear chronological record with a brief summary at the front that laid out the pattern plainly. He gave the original to Nora. He kept the copy himself because he'd been around institutions long enough to know that documentation had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient, and he wasn't going to let that happen. The second, Garrett received a call from the district advocacy office confirming that Patricia Morse had reviewed his submission and found sufficient basis to open a formal inquiry into classroom practices in room 14 at Maplewood Elementary. The inquiry would require additional documentation from inside the school counselor records, observation notes, staff testimony if available. Garrett called Nora's office. She was not surprised to hear from him. They had never spoken before, but Nora had been expecting this call or one like it for days. The father of a child she'd been documenting for 2 weeks calling about the thing they were both documenting independently. She had the folder open on her desk before he'd finished introducing himself. "How much do you have?" Garrett asked. "Enough," Nora said. "Combined with what Earl Briggs has documented, enough." A brief silence. "Earl Briggs," Garrett repeated. "Head custodian, 15 years in this building. He's been keeping a written record since the first week of October." Garrett absorbed this. "I don't know him." "Most people don't," Nora said. "That's why he sees everything." There was a school event the following week. Maplewood's annual family engagement evening classroom displays student work on the walls, parents drifting through with coffee cups, and the careful social performance of people who wanted to be seen participating. Merritt organized it with his usual administrative efficiency, sent the notice home in the weekly folder arranged for the gymnasium to be open with refreshments. Garrett received the notice, read it, set it on the kitchen table. That evening, Maya was doing homework at the table while he made dinner. She was working on a writing assignment, a paragraph about her favorite season. He could see her from the stove, bent over the paper pencil, moving with a focused deliberateness that he found quietly remarkable. She wrote the way she did most things she cared about completely. Whatever was on that page was receiving her full attention. "What are you writing about?" he asked. "Fall," she said, "because the leaves look like they're on fire." She paused, pencil still. "And fire is beautiful if nothing is getting hurt." He turned back to the stove. He stood there for a moment with the spatula in his hand. He would remember that sentence for the rest of his life. The Friday before the family engagement evening, Nora called him. The district inquiry was moving. Patricia Morse had requested school-level records which Merritt was now legally obligated to provide. But the engagement evening was next Thursday, and Nora felt it was important for him to know what she and Earl had built, the full shape of it, before he walked into that building, in a social context where Sylvia Dunn would be present. She told him about the notebook. She read him 3 of the entries. She told him about her session with Maya, about the underlined sentence, about the way a 7-year-old child had described her own presence in her own classroom. Garrett was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," Nora confirmed. He hung up, stood in the kitchen. Through the ceiling he could hear Maya moving around in her room, the small, ordinary sounds of his daughter existing in the space he'd made for her. The scrape of the desk chair, the soft thud of a book being set down, the creak of the floorboard near the closet that he kept meaning to fix, and had never fixed because he'd come to think of it as a kind of sonar, a small, reliable signal that she was there and moving and fine. He went to the drawer. He took out the folded piece of paper. He read it again, though he didn't need to. He knew it by now, the way you know a piece of music that is played often enough to live in you. "I'm nervous, but I think this could be home." He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to his closet. He looked at the uniform, pressed complete, hanging in its place. The full dress uniform of a brigadier general of the United States Army, the rank insignia, the commendations, the specific weight of 30 years of service made visible, immaterial, and wearable. He looked at it for a while. Then he closed the closet door. He laid out the dark slacks and the gray button-down, instead the civilian clothes of an ordinary man, and he thought about what he'd understood a long time ago in rooms that required it. Sometimes you gathered more information and commanded more genuine attention by not announcing what you were. The people who needed to perform in front of rank would perform. He didn't want performance. He wanted truth. He wanted to walk into Maplewood Elementary School on Thursday evening and see it exactly as it was. But there was one more day before Thursday, Wednesday morning, dark before dawn, Garrett standing at the kitchen counter with the cutting board in front of him. Apple slices, not wedges. Turkey on wheat. Crackers on the side. The kitchen quiet and cold, the light above the sink still carrying the thin paleness of pre-dawn. He folded the note, tucked it into the corner of the bag. He heard the small, careful footsteps on the stairs. Maya came in, Green sweater box braids neat the dark pants with the deep pockets. She looked at the counter, picked up the lunch bag and tucked it into the backpack with the star patch on the front. "Morning," he said. "Morning." They drove to school in the quiet of their mornings. Trees bare now most of the leaves down the Hartford streets in that late autumn state of having finished one thing and not yet begun another. He pulled up to the entrance. She unbuckled, shouldered the backpack. She held his hand at the entrance, fingers around two of his. The extra moment. He crouched down. He didn't say good day this time. He just looked at her, this 7-year-old girl with the too big backpack and the braids and the whole complicated interior world she carried so quietly. He smoothed a braid, held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. "See you tonight," he said. She looked at him with the particular attention of a child who notices when something is slightly different without being able to name what it is. Then she nodded, went inside. He stood at the entrance in the November cold and watched the door close. Stood there longer than he usually did. The morning went on around him, buses, children, the institutional motion of another school day beginning. One day. Tomorrow he would walk into that building without his uniform and without the announcement of who he was, and he would see what was on his daughter's classroom wall, and he would see the grade written in red on the paragraph about fire and leaves, and he would stand in the hallway outside room 14 and wait for a woman who did not know who he was to tell him things she believed he would simply accept. He had not accepted many things in his life that were unacceptable. He was not about to start now. He walked back to his car. Inside the building in the main corridor, a cart with a squeaky left wheel moved past the lockers. Earl Briggs was already in the building. Had been since 6:30. Would be there moving through the corridors, seeing everything until 4. The notebook was in his pocket. Everything that needed to be built had been built. He chose the gray button-down. Not the uniform, not the rank, not the 30 years of accumulated authority made visible in brass and ribbon in the posture of a man who had spent 3 decades being looked at in a specific way. Just a man, 58 years old, a father. He arrived at Maplewood Elementary at 6:45 on a Thursday evening in November when the parking lot was already half full and the building glowed warm from the inside with the light of institutional hospitality. Every classroom lit, the front doors propped open, the smell of coffee from the gymnasium drifting out into the cold air. He walked in without announcing himself. He moved through the front lobby, slowly, unhurried, the way he had learned to move through unfamiliar terrain when the objective was information rather than engagement. Families drifted around him, parents in coats, younger siblings carried on hips, grandparents moving more carefully on the polished floors. The hallways were lined with student work pinned to boards outside each classroom, the accumulated evidence of a semester's worth of learning made public and displayable. He found room 14's board without difficulty. He stood in front of it and read. The work was arranged the way classroom displays were always arranged. The strongest pieces near eye level, the borders color-coordinated the whole assembly, communicating a teacher who understood how things were supposed to look. There were math worksheets with perfect scores circled in green, book report covers with careful illustrations, a series of fall-themed writing assignments, one from each student arranged in 2 rows across the center of the board. He found Maya's in the second row. He read it. She had written about autumn, about driving to school in the mornings when the trees along the road were at peak color, the way the light came through them, the way individual leaves caught the sun and held it briefly before letting it go. She had written in the language of a child who thought carefully about words. The leaves look like they're on fire, and fire is beautiful when nothing is getting hurt. He stood with that sentence for a long time. Then he looked at this grade in the upper right corner of the page. C-. No comment, no note, no question mark or encouraging word or any indication that the teacher had read past the mechanics of the thing to the actual mind that had produced it. Just a letter and a minus sign written in red ink pressed into the paper with the definitive pressure of a verdict that expected no appeal. Garrett looked at that grade. He was not a man who displayed what he felt in real time. 30 years of command had built in him a fundamental separation between what he experienced internally and what his face communicated, a gap he could maintain under conditions of genuine stress. He had used it in briefing rooms and field operations and conversations with men who needed to believe he was certain when he was not entirely certain. He used it now. He stood in front of his daughter's paragraph about fire and leaves and let what he felt move through him without showing on his face, and without going anywhere. He noted it, filed it, let it become fuel rather than noise. He had been standing there for perhaps 4 minutes when the door to room 14 opened and Sylvia Dunn stepped into the hallway. She was carrying a clipboard. She wore a blazer over her school clothes, a small professional upgrade for the parent evening, and she had the expression of a teacher at a family event. The practiced warmth, the open-door body language, the smile that communicated availability and competence simultaneously. She was good at this part. She had been doing it for 27 years. She looked at Garrett. She did not recognize him. This was not surprising. He had never come to the school in uniform. Maya's file listed a guardian, a phone number, and a checkbox marked military affiliated that most people's eyes slid past without registering. To Sylvia Dunn, he was simply a parent she hadn't yet spoken with, a tall man in civilian clothes, standing in front of her classroom board, unremarkable in every visible way. She gave him the smile, full professional warmth. "Welcome. Are you in one of my rooms?" "Room 14, Garrett said. "Maya Hale is my daughter." The smile held its shape, but something behind it changed, a small, rapid recalibration happening in the eyes while the mouth maintained its position. She tilted her head with the practiced angle of concerned engagement. "Of course, Maya." A brief pause. "I've been meaning to connect with you. She's a sweet girl, truly, but I've noticed some challenges with focus and task completion that we might want to explore. She often seems to be somewhere else. Has she ever been assessed for any attention-related difficulties?" "No," Garrett said. "Has she ever asked for help in your class?" "She's quite quiet. I encourage all my students to self-advocate." "Has she ever raised her hand and been redirected before she could share?" A small pause. "I don't think that characterization. In the second week of October," Garrett said, "she brought a painting she'd made at home. During morning circle, she raised her hand to share it. You told her it wasn't part of the lesson and asked her to put it away." Sylvia's expression moved. "She never brought anything from home to share again," Garrett continued. His voice had not changed in pitch or pace. It carried the quality it always carried, measured, absolute, the voice of a man who had learned that control communicated more authority than volume ever could. 3 weeks later, during reading circle, she mispronounced a word. You sighed audibly and asked another student to correct her and said the class had covered the word. They hadn't. Not once. I think the context. And on a Thursday afternoon in late October, she gave an incorrect answer during a verbal math quiz. You stood beside her desk in silence for 30 seconds, in front of 31 other children, and then you said, "Maybe we need to call your mother." The hallway was quiet, not the quiet of an empty space, the quiet of a space where other people had stopped moving. A family had been drifting past, a mother and father and a child between them, and they had slowed and then stopped without quite meaning to, the way people stop when they sense that something true is happening nearby. A father near the water fountain had turned around. A woman with a toddler on her hip had gone motionless, the toddler sensing the change in the air and going quiet too. Sylvia's face had moved through several states and arrived somewhere complicated. Not guilt, not defiance. The expression of a person who has been confronted with an accurate account of their own behavior and is experiencing, perhaps for the first time in a while, the disorientation of having the story they'd told themselves interrupted by the plain facts of what they had actually done. "I want to ask you something specific," Garrett said. "In September, in front of her entire class, you dropped her worksheet on the floor. I'd like to know what educational outcome you were hoping to achieve." The color left Sylvia Dunn's face. Not gradually. Quickly, the way warmth leaves a room when a window is opened in winter. She opened her mouth, closed it. From the far end of the corridor, Principal Douglas Merritt appeared, doing his rounds with the administrative alertness of a man responsible for ensuring the evening ran smoothly. He registered the stillness outside room 14 from 30 feet away and moved toward it with the speed of someone who had learned to intercept situations before they became events. "Is there something I can help with?" he said, arriving with his professional smile already deployed. "I'm asking Mrs. Dunn a question," Garrett said pleasantly. "Why don't we step into my office and—" "I've been patient for 11 weeks, Garrett said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "My daughter walked into this building 11 weeks ago talking about everything. She talked about the leaves on the drive over. She told me new words she'd learned. She brought paintings she'd made because she was happy and she wanted to share what happiness looked like to her. He paused, and then she stopped. She stopped talking about school. She stopped bringing things home. She started sitting at the kitchen table and turning her fork over in her hands and asking me questions that no 7-year-old should have the vocabulary for. Another pause. I would like to know what happened in this building to make a 7-year-old girl decide the world wasn't worth describing anymore. The hallway had gone completely still. It was not a dramatic stillness. No one had gasped. No one had made a sound. It was the stillness that falls over a space when something true has been said out loud that everyone present already knew and had been waiting to hear named. The family that had stopped drifting stood where they were. More families from further down the corridor had stilled. The soft background noise of the gymnasium seemed somehow to have receded. From the left end of the corridor, Nora Aldrich appeared. She was carrying a folder. Dark green, thick with papers, the kind of folder that communicated that what was inside it had been assembled over time and with purpose. She walked toward the group outside room 14 with the directness of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was not going to miss it. Principal Merritt, her voice was clear and professional. I need to submit documentation compiled over the past 3 weeks. Counselor observation records, student session notes, and a written log of classroom incidents from a staff member who has been maintaining it since October. She paused. I've already filed a preliminary concern report with the District Family Advocacy Office. There is an active inquiry. Merritt looked at her. He looked at the folder. He looked at Garrett with the expression of a man recalculating the weight of what he'd been managing and finding for the first time that it was much heavier than he'd estimated. At the far end of the group, Earl Briggs stood with his cart. He had been in the building since 6:30, as he always was moving through the corridors, maintaining things. He had positioned himself at some point in the preceding minutes within sight of the hallway outside room 14. And he stood there now with his hands resting on the cart handle, the squeaky wheel still saying nothing. Because he had already said everything. It was in the folder Nora was holding. Merritt looked at him. Earl met his gaze and held it with the steadiness of a man who had spent 15 years being looked past and had decided tonight that he was done with that. Why don't we take this to the conference room, Merritt said. It was not quite a suggestion. The conference room filled with the people who mattered and the people who had followed because no one had stopped them, which was how it should be, Garrett thought, walking through the door last. The grandmother who had called 6 weeks ago and been told to wait had positioned herself near the back wall, arms crossed, jaw set. The father whose son had said he was stupid took a seat without being invited. Sandra, the mother of the girl with the Sunday stomach aches, stood near the door with her coat still on, as though she might need to leave quickly or might need to stay. She hadn't decided yet, and she wasn't going anywhere. Merritt sat at the head of the table. Sylvia to his right, her clipboard on the table in front of her, her hands folded on top of it, with a rigidity that communicated the effort required to maintain composure. Nora sat across from Sylvia, the green folder open in front of her. Garrett sat at Merritt's left. Earl stood near the side of the room he'd been gestured inside when Nora nodded toward him, and he stood now with the quiet authority of a man whose presence required no chair. Nora spoke first. She went through the documentation the way she went through everything methodically, calmly, one incident at a time, the dates and the observed behaviors and the recorded outcomes laid out in sequence without drama, because the sequence itself was dramatic enough. She described Maya's session in the counselor's office. The questions asked, the answers given, the sentence that had required underlining twice. She did not editorialize. She did not tell the room what to feel. She presented the record and let it speak with its own accumulated weight. When she finished, she closed the folder. Merritt looked at it. He did not ask to see it, which Nora noted, in which Garrett noted, in which Earl, from his position near the wall, noted in the way he noted everything, quietly, completely, without letting it show. Then Earl spoke. He had not prepared remarks. He was not the kind of man who prepared remarks. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke the way he'd written, plainly, in order, without embellishment. He described what he'd seen from the corridor. He described the worksheet falling. He described Maya's face as she straightened with the paper in her hands, and he described the expression he recognized because he had seen it before on someone he loved. He described 19 incidents across 11 weeks, not because he'd gone looking for them, but because he moved through this building every day, and what happened in this building was his business had been his business for 15 years, and he had decided in October that what was happening in room 14 required a record. He said the last part quietly. That little girl deserved better. Every kid in that room deserved better. He stopped. He had nothing more to add. The silence that followed was complete in a way that silences rarely are not, the silence of people waiting for the next thing to happen, but the silence of people sitting with something that had just been said and needed a moment to settle into them fully before anyone moved. Sylvia Dunn sat with her hands still folded on her clipboard. She had not spoken since the hallway. She had listened to Nora's documentation without producing counter-documentation because there was no counter-documentation. There was no alternate record. The pattern was real. She had been present for every incident in that folder. She had made choices in every one of those moments, and the choices were recorded now in a document that would go to the district and sit in a file that would follow her forward. Something was moving through her face that was difficult to name. Not guilt exactly, not defiance. Something older and more complicated. Something that lived underneath both of those things. She opened her mouth. I didn't think she... She stopped. The room went very still. Everyone heard the sentence that wasn't finished. It sat in the air above the table incomplete, and therefore somehow more complete than if she'd said every word. The absence at the end of it shaped the silence around the words that preceded it. The way a missing piece shapes a puzzle, you couldn't see it, but you knew exactly its size and shape. I didn't think she mattered enough for anyone to come. Nobody said it. Sylvia hadn't said it. But it was in the room. It had arrived with the 6 words she'd spoken and the 4 she hadn't, and every person sitting at that table felt it land. Garrett had not moved. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, still and deliberate. He had been in rooms before where something true had been revealed involuntarily. Rooms where people had said in one form or another the thing they had actually believed beneath the thing they'd been performing. He had learned in those rooms that the moment required stillness. Not response, not acceleration. Stillness. Let it exist. Let every person in the room hear it fully. He said very quietly, that is exactly the problem. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the grandmother, who had been standing against the back wall, uncrossed her arms. I called, she said. 6 weeks ago, I told them. Her voice was controlled and flat and carried the quality of someone who had been patient through the wrong kind of things for the wrong amount of time and had finally reached the place where patience was no longer the right response. I was told to wait. Garrett looked at her. I know, he said, and that should have been enough. She held his gaze. Something moved through her expression, not absolution, not relief, but the recognition of a person who has been waiting for someone to simply acknowledge what they already knew. To say out loud, you were right. You were always right. And it should not have taken this long. It is now, she said. Merritt spoke then. Administrative language formal and careful. The language of a man who understood that the meeting had moved past the point where he was steering it and was now managing documentation rather than outcomes. He outlined immediate actions, a formal review of classroom practices in room 14, a request to the district for investigative support, a meeting with the superintendent scheduled for the following Monday. He looked at Sylvia as he spoke in a way that was not unkind, but was absolutely clear. Sylvia did not respond. She sat with her hands on her clipboard and her face in that complicated, unresolved place, and she looked at the table in front of her. Garrett requested 2 things directly: a classroom transfer for Maya, effective immediately, and a formal remediation plan for Mrs. Dunn with specific benchmarks, subject to district oversight, not internal management alone. Merritt nodded to both. The nod of a man watching a situation he could have prevented 6 weeks ago resolve itself without him. After the meeting in the corridor outside the conference room, families dispersed slowly, the way people leave spaces where something important has happened, not rushing as though the weight of what had occurred needed a moment to be carried properly before anyone moved too quickly. Nora fell into step beside Garrett as he moved toward the exit. I'm sorry we didn't move faster, she said. He looked at her. You saw her. You documented it. You filed the report when no one was watching you to make sure you did. He paused. That matters. Don't forget it. He found Earl near the exit cart handle in his hands, preparing to finish the evening's rounds with the same calm routine that had characterized every evening of the past 15 years. Garrett stopped in front of him. He extended his hand. Earl took it, and Garrett gripped it with both of his, the full 2-handed grip of a man communicating something that didn't have adequate words and knew it. Earl looked at him steadily. She's a good girl, Earl said. She's the best person I know, Garrett said. Earl nodded once. He pushed his cart toward the corridor. The wheel squeaked. He moved on into the building back to the work that was always waiting. The following days moved with the swiftness of institutional machinery once it has been set in motion by something it cannot ignore. Sylvia Dunn was placed on administrative leave with pay pending the district review. Merritt implemented a new protocol for transfer students' mandatory counselor check-in within the first 2 weeks of enrollment, a dedicated point of contact, a 30-day follow-up assessment. It was exactly what should have existed already. Now it did. Patricia Morse at the District Advocacy Office confirmed the formal inquiry was proceeding and that Earl's documentation had been formally entered into the record. At the next school board meeting, Earl Briggs was recognized. He stood at the podium in his custodial uniform, the same uniform he wore every day. No concession to the occasion, and said almost nothing. He said that these were their kids, all of them, that was the job. The board gave him a standing ovation. He was visibly uncomfortable with it. He accepted it with a brief nod, returned to his seat, and left before the reception that followed because there were still things in the building that needed maintenance, and he was still the person responsible for them. Some people show you who they are by what they do when everyone is watching. Earl Briggs showed you who he was by returning to work when the watching was done. Sylvia Dunn sat in her kitchen the night after she was placed on leave. The house was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet she'd known in her classroom at the end of school days. That had been the quiet of an institution at rest. This was the quiet of her own life, the emptiness that arrives when the structure you've organized yourself around is suddenly absent, and you have to confront what's left without it. She opened a drawer and searched for a while before she found what she was looking for. An old photograph. She was 28 in it, standing in front of a chalkboard. They still had chalkboards then, and she was laughing. The real kind. The kind that came from something actually happening, something surprising and good, rather than something being performed for an audience. She set the photograph on the kitchen table where she would see it in the morning. Then she sat in her quiet kitchen and began for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember to think about what came next. The armor could come off. That was the thing she had been avoiding knowing or had known and had been avoiding facing. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't structural. It was a choice repeated daily, and choices could be reversed. Whether she reversed it was nobody's decision but hers. Nobody could make it for her. Nobody could guarantee she would make it. But sitting in that kitchen, with the photograph on the table, and the weight of the evening settling into her, it was the first time in a long time that the question had felt genuinely open. Maya's transfer to Mrs. Claudette Warren's class took effect on a Monday. Garrett had heard good things about Warren from 2 parents in the pickup line. Not testimonials exactly, just the specific way people speak about teachers who have genuinely affected their children. The way you can tell someone isn't describing a service, but an experience. She was 44 years old, had been at Maplewood for 9 years, and ran a classroom that was described by the children in it variously as kind of loud and she knows your name right away, and there's a lot of stuff on the walls. This last detail in Garrett's assessment was the most promising. Maya walked in on that Monday morning carrying the 2 big backpack with the star patch, and Mrs. Claudette Warren was at the door. Maya, she said as though she'd been expecting her, specifically as though this particular child's arrival was something she'd been looking forward to, not performing warmth, expressing it. I hear you're a really good writer. I can't wait to read your work. Maya stopped in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, just a moment, a breath's worth of time, and something moved through her face. And then she saw Wren already inside, already turned around in her seat, watching the door with the gap-toothed smile of someone who had been waiting and was now done waiting. Maya looked at Wren. Wren gave her a small, certain nod, the nod of someone who had saved a seat in every sense of the word. Maya walked in. By Wednesday, she had claimed the desk nearest the window. By Thursday, she and Wren had extended the territories game to incorporate 3 new sections of the playground with names that Wren said were technically words, and Maya said were definitely words, just new ones. By Friday, she was telling Garrett everything at dinner. Everything. The book they were reading in Warren's class, which had a dog that actually behaved like a dog, and she appreciated the realism after the previous book's unrealistic canine. The math game, which involved cards and a point system, and which she had initially approached with the careful suspicion of someone who had been ambushed by math before and was not prepared to lower her guard without evidence. She had been genuinely surprised to find herself enjoying it, and she announced this with a kind of formal solemnity, as though revising a previously stated position required proper acknowledgement. She had decided, she told him, that math was no longer categorically her enemy, and she was prepared to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis going forward. Garrett laughed. A real laugh. The full kind from somewhere below the professional composure, the kind that arrived without being planned and didn't ask permission. He hadn't heard it from himself in a while and was briefly surprised by it. Maya looked at him across the dinner table with an expression that was somewhere between pleased and curious. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're laughing at something." "I'm laughing because I missed this." "Missed what?" "You," he said. "Telling me things." She considered this, looked at her fork, looked back at him with the particular seriousness of a child receiving something important and deciding what to do with it. "I'll tell you everything," she said, simply, directly, as though it were obvious, as though the previous 11 weeks had been a weather system that had moved through and left the air clean behind it. Maybe for her it was already beginning to feel something like that. Children had a way of processing forward that adults lost somewhere in the accumulation of their own history. They could still move toward things with a directness that circumstances hadn't yet complicated. The damage was real. He knew that Nora had been clear about that some of what had been written into Maya over those 11 weeks would need time and patience and watchfulness to address. But the moving forward was also real. Both things were true at the same time. A child could be hurt and healing simultaneously. He was learning to hold both. He did not tell her about the meeting. He did not tell her about Earl's notebook or Nora's folder or the conversation outside room 14 or the sentence that had hung in the conference room air above Sylvia Dunn's unfinished thought. She was 7 years old. The architecture of what had been built on her behalf was not her burden to carry. It was his. Hers was the forward movement, the territories game, the math cards, the dog that finally behaved like a dog, the desk by the window, the friend who had been watching the door waiting for her to walk through it. 3 weeks after Maya started in Warren's class, she asked him to come to Family Sharing Day. She brought it up at breakfast casually, which he had learned was how she raised things that mattered to her, embedded in ordinary moments, offered without visible pressure, so that if the answer wasn't what she hoped, it wouldn't require a formal adjustment of expectations. She'd learned this form of self-protection somewhere in those years before him, and he tried, when he recognized it, to respond in a way that made it unnecessary, to make the answer what she hoped, so she'd eventually stop protecting herself from him. "Mrs. Warren does Family Sharing Day next Friday," she said. "Parents come and you talk about your job or something you know about. You want me to come?" She lifted one shoulder in a half shrug that was doing considerable work. "You don't have to." "Do you want me to?" A pause. The pause of someone checking whether it was safe to want something. "Yes. Then I'll be there." She went back to her cereal. Then a moment later, without looking up, "You don't have to wear the uniform." She paused. "But you can." He looked at her. She was focused on her bowl with great deliberateness, the way she focused on things when she'd said something that mattered, and was giving him room to respond without the pressure of being watched while he did it. "Okay," he said. On Friday morning, he put on the uniform. He hadn't worn it to Maplewood before. He'd made that choice consciously in September and had maintained it: the civilian clothes, the ordinary father presentation, the deliberate absence of rank. But Maya had offered him the uniform. She had held it out like something she wanted people to see, and he understood, in the way he had slowly learned to understand the things she communicated sideways, that this was not a small thing. She wanted her father in the building. Not just a man named Garrett Hale. Her father. All of him. Everything he was. She was ready for people to see what she came from. He wore it. When he walked into Mrs. Warren's classroom at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning in December, the room went quiet, the way certain rooms go quiet, not with shock or alarm, but with a kind of automatic attention, the instinctive recognition that something significant had entered the space. The children looked at him with the wide, unguarded curiosity of people who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking, which is one of the genuinely wonderful things about children. Warren was at the front. She looked at him with warm professionalism, and welcomed him by name because she had learned the names of the people who mattered to her students. Maya was in the second row. When she saw him, her face opened. It was not a small thing, that opening. He had spent 3 years learning the register of Maya's expressions, the careful neutral, the almost smile, the watchful calculation, the compressed stillness she used when managing something difficult. He knew each of them with the precision of someone who had paid very close attention to something that mattered more than anything else. This expression was different from all of them. This was the face of a child who was not managing anything, not performing anything, not protecting anything. She saw her father, and something in her simply opened like a room that had been keeping itself dark for a long time and had finally decided it was safe to let the light in. She sat up straighter. He talked to the children for 20 minutes. He told them about service, not war, not tactics, not the machinery of military life, but the idea underneath all of it, the decision to do something, because it mattered even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. He told them that courage was not the feeling of being unafraid. He told them it was the decision that something mattered more than the fear. He told them that the bravest people he had ever known were not the ones who felt nothing. They were the ones who felt everything and chose to keep going anyway. A boy in the front row, freckled, serious, the kind of child who asked questions that arrived from places adults didn't expect, raised his hand. "What's the scariest thing you've ever done?" The room was quiet. Garrett looked at the boy for a moment. Then, without making a production of it, his gaze moved to Maya. She was looking back at him, steady, attentive, her pencil resting still on the desk in front of her. She had stopped writing. She was just looking at him with the full open attention she gave to things that mattered. "Loving someone," he said. The room was very quiet now. "Because when you love someone, you have something to lose. And that is terrifying." He paused. Let it sit in the room for a moment, let it be heard by everyone it needed to reach. But it's also the whole point. A few children exchanged glances, the uncertain expressions of people processing something that turned out to be larger than they'd prepared for. The boy with freckles nodded slowly with the gravity of someone filing this in a specific place for later use. Maya looked at her desk. Then she looked up. She was blinking fast the way she did when she was managing something she didn't want to spill in front of people. But at the edges of it, just visible at the corners of her mouth, at the slight lift of her whole face, was the beginning of a smile. Not the almost smile, not the careful neutral. The real one, the one that changed everything about her face, the one he had first seen in this house, and had been in the months since working toward reclaiming. He held her gaze for a moment. Then Warren was speaking again, transitioning to the next part of the morning, with the easy authority of a teacher who knew how to hold a room, and the air began to breathe normally again. And Garrett found a chair near the back wall and sat in it, and watched his daughter turn back to her work with the settled quality of a child who is exactly where she is supposed to be, doing exactly what she is supposed to be doing, with the people she is supposed to be with. He sat there for a while longer than he needed to. He didn't want to leave. In the car afterward, heading home on the December roads, bare trees everywhere. The low winter sun stretching long, pale shadows across the pavement. The smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney drifting through the ventilation. Maya was quiet for a while. Not the managing quiet, not the fork-turning quiet that meant she was working something difficult out in the interior spaces where she kept her complicated things. Just the quiet of a person who has a lot to hold and is holding it comfortably without strain, the way you hold something you've been given that you trust won't be taken back. The heater ran, the road unreeled ahead of them. "Dad?" "Yeah, I'm glad you're my dad." He kept his eyes on the road. The bare trees, the low winter light laying itself flat across everything, the way December light does when it's trying its best with what it has. "I'm glad you're my kid," he said. "Every single day. Not most days. Every day." She was quiet for a moment, receiving that. "Then Mrs. Warren says I'm a really good writer." "I know." She turned to look at him. "How you haven't seen my new stuff yet?" He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Because the note you left me the first week you moved in, you were 5 years old. You wrote, 'I'm nervous, but I think this could be home.'" He paused. Perfectly. Every word exactly right. A 5-year-old who wrote the word nervous correctly and meant every syllable of it. Another pause. "That's a writer." Silence, huh? "You kept that." "It's in my desk." She stared at him. He could feel the weight of her looking at him without turning to meet it. "I'll keep it forever," he said. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she turned and looked out the window. The bare trees moved past on either side. The December light stretched flat and golden across the road ahead of them, the kind of light that doesn't try to be dramatic, that just does what it can with the short hours it has. She watched it for a while, and something in her posture changed, a small final settling, like a thing that has been searching for the exact shape of the space made for it and has finally found it and can rest. She nodded once, slow and certain. She was filing something away. He recognized the motion of it, had seen it in her before, the particular internal gesture of a child placing something in a location she will always be able to find. Not forgetting, not moving on, not letting go, keeping, putting it somewhere deep and permanent where it would stay and stay, where she could reach for it in the years ahead and find it exactly as it was in this moment, on this road in this December light with this man driving her home. She would carry it for the rest of her life. He knew this the way he knew the things that mattered most. Not with data, not with analysis, but with the deep, bone-level certainty of a man who had learned late, and completely and without reservation, what it meant to love someone past the point of being afraid of losing them. Past the point where the fear of loss could make you hold back. Past all the careful, rational distance he had built over 30 years of living in rooms where feelings were liabilities. All of that was gone now. This was what was left. This car, this road, this girl. The road continued. Hartford came back into view ahead of them. The winter light held as long as it could. He drove his daughter home.